Here's a question. If you had to start over, completely from zero, what would you actually do? Not what would you buy? What would you do? I've thought about this a lot. Because here's the thing. Most people, when they imagine getting wealthy, imagine some external event, a windfall, a lucky break, the right opportunity showing up. But the people who actually do this almost never describe it that way. They describe a path, a specific one, with specific steps that start from wherever they were, even if that was nothing. Today, I want to walk through that path, not theory, the actual steps, the ones I'd take if I were starting today. This is the bigger picture. Let me show you something. 2 points. Here's where someone is, and here's where they want to be. Between those 2 points, there's a space. I call this the performance gap. And here's what's interesting about it. The difference between someone who closes this gap and someone who spends their entire life stuck in it isn't talent, it isn't luck, it's obsession. Specifically, obsession with closing that exact space. Let me show you what most people's path actually looks like. Up a little, down a little, sideways for a while, up again, down again, over and over, for years, sometimes decades, never quite arriving. Now here's what the path looks like for someone who does arrive. Not a straight line, there are still ups and downs, but there's a direction, a consistent, upward, lean. Even when individual months go backward, the overall trajectory keeps moving toward that second point. Here's the question worth asking. What's actually different between these two paths? Because it's not starting conditions. People with very similar starting points end up on completely different paths. Some close the gap in a decade, others never close it at all. Same gap, same distance, different everything else. I think the honest answer is that closing the gap requires something most people aren't willing to do, not because it's hard exactly, because it's uncomfortable. It requires narrowing. Most people, when they think about improving their financial situation, think about adding things. A new income stream, a new investment, a new strategy. Adding feels productive. But here's what closing the gap usually actually requires. Removing things, distractions, comfortable routines. Things that feel fine but don't move anything forward. This is uncomfortable because it means admitting that some of what's currently happening isn't actually necessary, it's just familiar. And familiar feels safe. And here's something else about the gap that's worth understanding. It doesn't close evenly. For a long time, it can feel like nothing is happening. The gap looks basically the same size, month after month. And then something shifts. Not because of one big moment, because of all the small things that were happening underneath, finally reaching a point where they become visible. This is the same pattern we've talked about before. The snowball, the compounding, the first 100,000. The gap closes the same way. Slowly, slowly, slowly. Then noticeably. Here's what I want you to take from this. If you're looking at the gap between where you are and where you want to be, and it feels enormous, that feeling is normal. It's supposed to feel that way at the start. The size of the gap today isn't a measurement of how long it will take. It's just where you're starting from. What actually determines the timeline is what happens next, and that's what we're going to talk about now. Let me make this more concrete. Picture 2 people. Both want the same thing, let's say financial independence by a certain age. Both can see the gap clearly, both genuinely want to close it. Here's where they differ. The first person treats closing the gap as a background goal. It's there, it matters, but it competes with everything else. Career, family, social life, rest. All reasonable, all important, and closing the gap gets whatever's left over. Some months, that's meaningful effort. Other months, it's nothing. Life got busy. The second person treats closing the gap differently, not as the only thing that matters, but as something that gets protected. Specific time, specific resources, set aside, deliberately, not whatever's left over, allocated, first. Here's what happens to these two people over 5 years. The first person makes progress, real progress even, but it's inconsistent. Some periods of real movement, followed by periods of standing still. Net result after 5 years, some progress, meaningful even. But the gap is still substantial. The second person also has ups and downs. Life happens to them too. But the protected time and resources kept showing up, even during hard periods, even if it was less than usual. Something kept happening. After 5 years, the gap has closed significantly, not because the second person was smarter, not because they had better opportunities, because closing the gap was treated as something that happens, regardless of how the rest of life is going. Here's the part I think is most important. From the outside, these two people might look almost identical, similar jobs, similar lifestyles, similar struggles. The difference isn't visible in any single moment. It's only visible when you compare the trajectories over time. This is why it's so easy to underestimate. If you're the first person, there's no specific moment where you can point and say, this is where I went wrong. There wasn't a wrong moment. There just wasn't a protected one either. And if you're the second person, there's no specific moment of, now I've made it. Just a long series of protected moments that eventually added up to something visible. The question worth asking yourself isn't, how big is my gap? It's, is anything currently protected? Because that answer predicts the trajectory more than almost anything else. So, how do you actually close the gap? Here's a way to think about it that I find useful. Imagine two vehicles, not literal vehicles, but think of them that way for a moment. The first vehicle is how you generate income, your work, your skills, whatever you do, that produces money. The second vehicle is what you do with some of that money, investing it, letting it grow, putting it to work separately from your time. Here's why I think of these as two separate vehicles, instead of just one thing called finances, because they require completely different things from you. The first vehicle requires your active involvement, your time, your effort, your decisions ongoing. The second vehicle works best when it requires almost nothing from you. Set up once, left alone, allowed to do what it does. Here's where I think people get this wrong. They try to make one vehicle do both jobs. Either they focus entirely on the first vehicle, working harder, earning more, climbing higher, while the second vehicle never gets built at all. Whatever extra income exists goes toward more lifestyle, not toward the second vehicle, or they focus entirely on the second vehicle. Researching investments, following the markets, treating investing itself like a job, while the first vehicle, the thing that actually generates the money to invest, gets neglected. Here's what I think actually works. Build the first vehicle to be as efficient as possible. Not make as much money as possible at any cost. Efficient, meaning it generates meaningful income without consuming your entire life. This usually means finding something at the intersection of three things: something you're reasonably good at, something that doesn't drain you completely, and something people are willing to pay for. Notice, I didn't say something you're passionate about. Passion is nice, but passion alone doesn't pay bills. And I didn't say something that pays the most, regardless of everything else, because if it drains you completely, there's nothing left for the second vehicle, or for anything else. The intersection of skill, sustainability, and demand is usually where the first vehicle should live. Once that's running, here's the principle for the second vehicle. It should require as little ongoing attention as possible. Not because attention is bad, because attention is exactly the resource the first vehicle needs more of. If the second vehicle requires constant decisions, constant research, constant monitoring, it's competing with the first vehicle for the same limited resource, time and energy. The second vehicle, done well, looks almost boring. Automatic contributions, broad, diversified investments, long-time horizons, not because boring is a virtue in itself, but because boring is what allows it to run without taking anything away from the first vehicle. Two vehicles, one that requires you and pays you for your active effort, one that requires almost nothing and pays you simply for time passing. Most people have one of these. The people who close the gap fastest build both, deliberately in that order. Let's talk about the first vehicle, the active one. How do you actually find the thing at that intersection? Skill, sustainability, demand. Here's where I'd start, not with a blank page, with your current life. Think about what you already do, at work, in your free time, for friends and family without being asked. Somewhere in there, there's usually something that fits at least two of the three. Let me give you some examples of how this tends to show up. Maybe there's something you do at your job that you're genuinely good at, something other people struggle with that comes relatively easily to you. Organizing complex information, explaining things clearly, solving a specific kind of problem. You might not think of this as a skill in the marketable sense. It's just what you do, part of the job. But here's the question. Does that skill only have value inside that one job? Often, the answer is no. Other businesses, smaller ones especially, need exactly that and don't have anyone who does it well. That skill intersecting with demand. The sustainability question comes next. Could you do more of this without it draining you completely? If the honest answer is, I already do too much of this and I'm exhausted, that's useful information. It tells you this might not be the right vehicle, even if it checks the other boxes. But if the answer is, I actually don't mind this and I have some capacity for more of it, that's a strong signal. Here's another way this shows up. Think about questions people ask you, repeatedly, friends, family, co-workers. If there's a topic where people consistently come to you, that's demand showing up in a very direct way. Combined with the fact that you're answering these questions easily, repeatedly, that's skill. The sustainability question, again, does answering these questions energize you or drain you? If it energizes you, even a little, you might have found something. Here's what I want to be clear about. This first vehicle doesn't need to be your life's calling. It doesn't need to be something you'd do even if you weren't paid. That's an unrealistic standard that keeps a lot of people from starting anything at all. It needs to be sustainable enough to continue and valuable enough to someone that they'll pay for it. That's it. 2 requirements, not 3. The third one, passion, is a bonus if it's there. But it's not the foundation. The foundation is, can I do this repeatedly without it costing me everything? And does someone somewhere find this valuable enough to pay for it? If yes to both, you've found your first vehicle. Maybe not the final version of it, but a starting version. And a starting version is infinitely more valuable than a perfect version that never starts. Now let's talk about the second vehicle, the passive one. And I want to start with something that might sound counterintuitive. The goal here isn't to get good at investing. I know that sounds strange in a conversation about building wealth. But here's what I mean. There's a difference between being good at investing and being good at staying invested. The first one involves research, analysis, picking things, timing things. The second one involves almost none of that. It involves setting something up correctly once, and then mostly leaving it alone. Here's why this distinction matters so much. The first approach, being good at investing in the active sense, requires ongoing time and attention, which, as we discussed, is exactly the resource your first vehicle needs. The second approach requires almost none of that on an ongoing basis, which means it doesn't compete with anything else you're doing. So what does set up correctly once actually look like? A few things. First, broad rather than narrow. Instead of trying to identify which specific companies will do well, own, essentially, all of them, through a broad market fund. This isn't a compromise, it's not settling for average. Historically, this approach has outperformed the majority of people who tried to do better than average by picking individually. Second, automatic rather than manual. A contribution that happens regardless of whether you remembered this month or felt like it or had time to think about it. Set up once runs without requiring a decision ever again. Third, long horizon rather than short. This is money that isn't meant to be touched for a long time, years, often decades, which means short-term movements, the kind that dominate financial news, are largely irrelevant to it. Here's what's powerful about combining these three things: broad, automatic, long horizon, together. They create something that requires almost nothing from you after the initial setup. No daily checking, no reacting to news, no ongoing decisions. It just runs. And here's the thing about things that just run. They're the things still running 5 years from now, 10, 30. Not because of willpower sustained for decades, because of a system set up once. I want to address something directly. This might sound almost too simple. Where's the strategy? Where's the edge? Here's the honest answer. The edge isn't in the investments themselves. The edge is in the fact that this approach is one of the only ones that most people can actually sustain for decades without it requiring anything that competes with the first vehicle. That's not a lack of sophistication. That's the entire point. I want to talk about something now, something that I think determines more about someone's trajectory than almost anything else we've discussed. The difference between an obstacle and an excuse. These get confused with each other constantly, but they're not the same thing. And confusing them is, I think, the single most common reason. The gap never closes. Here's the distinction. An obstacle is something real. It's between you and where you want to be. It doesn't go away on its own, but it can potentially be addressed, worked around, solved, reduced. An excuse is also something real often, but it's something that's been assigned a role, the role of explaining why nothing can happen yet. Here's how to tell the difference practically. Ask yourself this question about whatever's standing in your way. If I had to, is there anything I could do about this? If the honest answer is yes, but it would be hard or uncomfortable or take time, that's an obstacle. Hard, uncomfortable, takes time, all true, all real, but addressable. If the honest answer is no, genuinely, there's nothing I could do, that's rare, genuinely rare. Most things that feel like nothing I could do are actually nothing I'm currently willing to do, which is different. Here's why this distinction matters so much. Obstacles get worked on, even slowly, even imperfectly. Progress happens. Excuses get maintained. They don't need to be worked on. Their entire function is to explain why work isn't happening. And here's the uncomfortable part. Excuses often feel completely valid. They're not lies, usually. The circumstances they describe are often real. I don't have time, often true. I don't have enough money to start, often true. My situation is more complicated than most people's, often true, but true. And nothing can be done, are different claims. Let me give you a way to test this for yourself. Take whatever's currently functioning as your biggest excuse and ask, what would I do if this weren't an option as an excuse anymore? Not, how would I solve it perfectly? Just, what would the first step even look like? Often, when people actually do this exercise, they're surprised. The first step is usually smaller and more available than the excuse suggested. Not because the underlying issue wasn't real, but because the excuse had grown larger than the actual obstacle. Excuses tend to do that. They expand, they become the whole picture, when usually they're describing something more specific and more limited than they appear. Here's what I want you to take from this. You probably do have real obstacles. Everyone does. The question isn't whether they exist. The question is, are they being worked on even slowly, or are they being maintained as the reason nothing else can happen yet? That answer says more about the next 10 years than almost anything else we could discuss. Let's talk about something practical now, because everything we've discussed, the two vehicles, obstacles versus excuses, all of it requires something: time, money, energy. And here's the thing about these three resources: they're limited for everyone, including people who've already closed significant gaps. I want to walk through a simple exercise. Take a piece of paper. List out everything you currently do, not just work, everything: hobbies, social activities, habits, routines. Now, for each one, think about three things. How much money does this cost monthly? How much time does this take monthly? How much energy does this require? Here's what tends to happen when people do this honestly. The list is longer than expected, and some things on it are costing more in one or more of these categories than they're actually worth. Not in a moral sense, not this is bad, just in a is this proportional sense. Here's an example of how this might look. Something that takes 2 hours a day, and if you're honest, doesn't add much, doesn't energize you, doesn't move anything forward. It's just what fills that time currently. 2 hours a day is 14 hours a week. Over a year, that's more than 700 hours, redirected toward the first vehicle we discussed. Building that skill-based income is a meaningfully different outcome than 700 hours spent on something that doesn't move anything. I'm not saying eliminate everything that isn't productive. Rest matters, enjoyment matters, relationships matter. But here's the question worth asking. Looking at your list, is there anything that's costing significant time, money, or energy that you genuinely struggle to explain the value of if asked? Not, is this bad? Just, is this proportional to what it's costing me? If you find one or two things like that, you've potentially found the resources for your first vehicle. Not from nowhere, from redirecting something that wasn't actually serving you as much as it appeared to. Here's the last thing I'll say about this. This isn't about doing more, working more hours, adding more to an already full life. It's about redirecting, taking resources that are already being spent somewhere and being more deliberate about where. The total amount of time, money, and energy you have probably isn't going to change much, but what it's currently going toward might be worth a second look. I want to talk about one more thing, something that I think compounds even more than money: knowledge, specifically the habit of continuing to learn after whatever formal education someone had ends. Here's what I've noticed. A lot of people, once they finish school or training or whatever structured learning they had, stop, not consciously, not as a decision. It just stops being something that happens. Life gets full. Learning becomes something that happened in the past. Here's why I think this matters more than people realize. Think of everything you currently know as a foundation. Basic concepts, fundamental skills, the things that everything else gets built on top of. If that foundation stops growing, here's what happens over time. The world keeps changing. New information, new approaches, new ways of doing things, and the foundation stays the same. The gap between what you know and what's currently relevant slowly widens, not dramatically, not all at once, but consistently. Here's the part that connects to everything else we've discussed. Remember the first vehicle, the active one? The thing you're good at that people pay for? That thing exists in a world that's changing. If your knowledge about that thing stops growing, the thing you're good at slowly becomes less relevant. Not because you got worse at it, because the world moved and the foundation didn't. Here's the encouraging part. This works exactly like the compounding we've discussed in every other context. Each new thing you learn doesn't exist in isolation. It connects to things you already know, which means the more you know, the faster new things make sense. Patterns become visible that weren't visible before. Connections appear between things that seemed unrelated. This is why people who've been learning continuously for decades often seem to grasp new things remarkably quickly. It's not that they're smarter, it's that they have more foundation for new information to attach to. Here's what I want to suggest practically. This doesn't need to be formal, it doesn't need to be going back to school or getting another degree. It can be as simple as staying curious about the things connected to your first vehicle. What's changing in that space? What's new? What are people who are ahead of where you want to be paying attention to? Even an hour a week of genuinely engaging with this compounds, the same way everything else in this conversation compounds, slowly, invisibly, for a long time, and then noticeably. Here's the connection to everything else. The gap we started with closes through the two vehicles. The two vehicles require your resources deliberately allocated, and the first vehicle, specifically, stays valuable through continued learning. Everything connects. Nothing in this conversation exists in isolation, which is maybe the entire point. If you're still here, let's take stock of what we've covered. We started with a gap, the space between where someone is and where they want to be. We talked about why most people never close it, not lack of intelligence, not lack of opportunity, a lack of protection, of deliberate allocation. Closing it requires treating it as something that happens, regardless of how the rest of life is going. We talked about two vehicles, one active, built at the intersection of skill, sustainability, and demand, one passive, built to require almost nothing once it's running. We talked about obstacles versus excuses, how obstacles get worked on, and excuses get maintained, and how the difference is rarely about whether something is hard, it's about whether it's addressable. We talked about resources, how time, money, and energy are limited, and how closing the gap usually requires redirecting some of what's already being spent, rather than finding entirely new resources. And we talked about the knowledge account, how continuing to learn keeps the first vehicle relevant, and how that learning compounds the same way everything else does. If any of this landed differently, if something here felt like it applied to you specifically, I'd invite you to stay close to this channel, subscribe, not for predictions, not for hype, for frameworks like this one, the kind that once you see them, you start noticing everywhere, and share this with someone who's been feeling that gap, who knows it's there, but hasn't had a way to think about closing it. Sometimes a framework is the thing that turns "I should do something about this" into actually doing something. And now, let's finish with the question this entire conversation has been circling. Not what should you do, something more specific than that. Here's the question, not what should you do. What would you do if you had no excuses left? Sit with that for a second, not what's the perfect plan? Just, if every reason you currently have for not starting simply wasn't available anymore. What would the first move actually be? I think, for most people, the honest answer to that question isn't complicated. It's usually something small. Opening an account, having a conversation, writing something down, starting something that's been sitting unstarted for a while. Here's what's interesting about this. That small thing was probably always available. The excuses weren't preventing it exactly. They were explaining why it hadn't happened yet, which is different. I want to go back to where we started, the gap, the space between where you are and where you want to be. Everything we've discussed today, the vehicles, the obstacles, the resources, the learning, all of it is really just different ways of looking at the same thing. How do you move from one side of that gap to the other? And here's what I think is true about every person who's ever closed a gap like this. At some point, they stopped waiting for the gap to feel smaller and started moving while it still felt large. The gap doesn't shrink first and then you move, and somewhere along the way, without a specific moment you can point to, it's smaller than it was. That's the entire mechanism. Not motivation, not a perfect plan. Movement, sustained, while the gap still feels too big to close. So here's what I'd leave you with. Not go change your life today. Something smaller, the thing you identified. When you asked yourself, what would I do if I had no excuses left? Do that thing, not the whole plan, just that one thing, this week if possible. Because here's what that does. It doesn't close the gap, not by itself, but it starts the only process that ever does. Movement, while the gap still feels too big, followed by more movement, followed by, eventually, a gap that's smaller than it used to be. Not because it shrank on its own, because someone started moving before it did. If this conversation has been worth your time, share it with someone standing at the edge of their own gap, looking at it, feeling its size, not yet moving. Sometimes, that's all someone needs. Not a solution, just permission to start before it feels ready. Leave a comment below. What's the one thing you'd do if you had no excuses left? Because the next conversation starts with what you need most. This is the bigger picture: money, wealth, and the life you're building. We'll see you in the next one.